Hello, my name is Erika Dotson, and I'm a third grade mathematics teacher. The title of my research study is How Manipulatives Affect Achievement in Solving Third Grade Mathematical Word Problems. The background of this research study began as an interest when I was student teaching in the fourth grade mathematics classroom. However, now that I am a third grade mathematics teacher, my interest sparked even more when I started to watch my students struggle in solving multi-step word problems. I stated in my second bulleted point that in the third grade, students transition from learning to read to then reading to learn. Students begin experiencing a higher level of self-dependence. So it is from that transition from second grade on into third grade that students are no longer being taught the skills of how to read and honing in on those skills for reading comprehension. However, they are using the skills that they've been taught and using the skills learned to now read to learn. So in the third grade, that transition is critical. And in my interest for supporting students in solving word problems, it is with my hopes at the beginning of this research study to find a strategy that works, find a strategy that will allow students to become more academically successful in solving these word problems. In my last bulleted point for this section, I stated that students desire a more concrete strategy to solve word problems, to break down abstract ideas into mathematical word problems. I was noticing at the beginning of this school year, as my first year in the third grade mathematics classroom, that students, they really struggled to take those words off the paper and find a good starting point into solving word problems, especially multi-step that required them to do more than just take the few numbers that are in the word problem and do something with them. They had to work through multiple steps to get to where they were going and to solve accurately. I had two research questions for this research study. The first one was, how do manipulatives promote academic success when solving mathematical word problems? I wanted to see whether manipulatives truly were supportive in helping these students be successful in solving word problems, or if manipulatives were not supportive in helping students solve word problems. I really wanted to see if this was a strategy that could work and could support students. The second question was, how is cognitive processing strengthened when separating abstract ideas into concrete concepts? Students have a hard time cognitively processing some of the word problems that are put in front of them, especially when they struggle with that reading comprehension piece that they really need. So my question to this was, were these math manipulatives going to help them pull those words off of the page in order for them to solve? Would it give them a good solid foundation? Would it give them a good place to start when solving? How would they use them? I wanted to see, were they going to use them while they're reading? Are they going to use them before they start solving? I was really curious to see how this was going to help them solve these multi-step equations in word problems. So in the first bulleted point, I stated that these questions challenge the research study as to whether math manipulatives will enhance students' abilities to solve these word problems. The second bulleted point stated that students desire strategies that will support them in solving word problems. These students, at the beginning of the school year, when they were first introduced to word problems, especially the multi-step ones, I could see the look on their face that they were looking for something to help them, looking for something to support them. And as I am trying to push them at that point in the semester, push them and encourage them verbally to solve these word problems and find a good starting point, they really were desiring something to be put in their hands that would help them. The literature for the first bulleted point, I stated that each researcher included in the literature review was searching for ways to support students in being successful in completing word problems using manipulatives. So the research that I reviewed was fluid along with the lines of what I was looking for as well. I was trying to find research on based on math manipulatives in solving word problems. I wanted to see where other researchers got with their study. I noticed that a lot of the researchers were trying to implement these manipulatives for the same reason that I was, to separate those abstract ideas and convert them into more concrete concepts. So in the second bulleted point, I stated manipulatives were implemented in a variety of ways through each study, but serve the same purpose in solving word problems. So as I stated before, these researchers were not doing a research study on the same exact thing that I was. However, they were linear with what I was looking for. The third bulleted point says researchers found that students were greater equipped to solve word problems with the cognitive support that manipulatives provided. So then again, I'm looking for something that would support these students in being equipped and feel more prepared to begin the initial starting point of solving more problems and flow more easily in their comprehensive thinking and thinking skills to solve these word problems. The fourth bulleted point states manipulatives aid students in separating abstract ideas into more concrete concepts. And there's that term, pulling words off of pages. So the studies that I've reviewed were conclusive in that manipulatives did support students in pulling those words off of pages, that the manipulatives supported a more hands-on learning. And so in math, we are doing a lot of hands-on learning. We are writing out the equations. We're drawing pictures to help us solve. So when solving word problems, I kind of wanted to stay within that same umbrella of giving students a way to work through the problems other than just reading and writing out the equations. And so the literature that I reviewed, the researchers were seeing the same thing and desiring the same thing. They questioned, are math manipulatives going to do that for our students, or are they not going to help support our students in being academically successful? And the second to last bulleted point states manipulatives encourage more active hands-on learning. Again, while students are reading, they are not sitting there struggling and comprehending what they're reading. However, they are beginning to use their hands to work through the problems as they're reading it. And it is at that point that they are able to convert what's going on up here onto paper from their hands. They're working while they're reading, which is supporting them and separating those abstract ideas. And the last bulleted point says conceptual understanding is strengthened through the use of manipulatives. The literature that I reviewed, again, it supported students in being more academically successful and when they are trying to use manipulatives as a way to enhance conceptual understanding. Going back to what I stated earlier about that transition from second grade to third grade, a lot of students get lost in the translation of what the word problem is trying to portray. What is it asking me to do? Where do I start? Where am I going with this? So the literature that I implemented into my own research study was very linear in what I was looking for as far as our manipulate is going to help support my students. So I was encouraged in what I was reading before I started my initial research study. Methods. This research study was conducted in a third grade classroom composed of 23 students. These are my 23 students. This is a very small rural school in East Tennessee composed of 2 teachers per grade level. So I'm the only mathematics teacher for third grade. Our students are ability leveled, meaning that we have 2 separate classrooms and they are placed in those classrooms based on the standardized test scores from the previous year in second grade. Students who met expectations or exceeded expectations on that standardized test were placed in one classroom, and students who scored at below or approaching expectations were placed in another classroom. So there are 2 classrooms. For this research study, I implemented the math manipulatives to solve word problems in the classroom composed of students who met expectations or mastered expectations. The reason why I chose that is because in that lower classroom, I still have several students who cannot read, that are still learning to read. And I felt as if implementing this research study into that classroom, my data that I would collect would not have validity, as some students cannot read. And so if they cannot read, they cannot use those math manipulatives effectively to get that data that I need to show whether or not math manipulatives truly do support students in separating abstract ideas into concrete concepts. For this research study, again, I did implement math manipulatives, but I implemented 3 math manipulatives. The reason why I implemented 3 was because at the point in the traditional school year that I began this research study, all content standards had been covered. And it was at that point that we were beginning a review process before standardized testing was initiated. So for the manipulatives, I chose colored counters, unifix cubes, and fraction tiles. Each of these three manipulatives, they could have been used for the math word problems for a variety of content standards. So those touched on each of the content standards and the needs that these students needed to be met in solving word problems. They were supportive. The third bullet point says a pre-assessment was used as a way to compare data. I did give a pre-assessment before beginning this research study. The pre-assessment was composed of 5 word problems that were 2-step. Students were not given the support of math manipulatives. They solved these 5 2-step word problems on their own without the manipulatives. I collected the data on that as a way to compare data going forward within the research study. Mainly to the weekly quizzes. And that's what leads me to my second to last bulleted point. It states that weekly quizzes and daily exit tickets were distributed. Daily exit tickets were given Monday through Thursday. The daily exit tickets were composed of 2 math word problems that were each 2-step. Those were given with math manipulatives every single day. On Friday, there was a weekly quiz. It was composed of 5 word problems that were 2-step. Again, it was very closely aligned to the pre-assessment. However, for each of these weekly quizzes moving forward throughout the 3 weeks, they were given the manipulatives. The last bulleted point states that level of achievements were similar when scoring these assessments. What I mean by that is the daily exit tickets were at a greater risk when scoring because there were only 2 word problems and they were scored whether they got it correct or they did not get it correct. So if students got 2 out of 2, they reached mastery. If they scored a 1 out of 2, they were scored at approaching mastery, and if they scored a 0 out of 2, they were scored at below. So they were higher risk. However, the weekly quiz was composed of 5 word problems. So the scoring rubric on that one was a bit different. It was a little less high risk. If students got a 5 out of 5, they reached mastery. If students got 3 or 4 out of 5, they met expectations. If students got a 2 out of 5, they were approaching expectations. And if they scored a 1 or 0 out of 5, they were below expectations. So a little less high risk, they were more susceptible of scoring in the approaching range, whereas on the weekly, the daily exit tickets, if they got 0 or 1 out of 2 correct, they were approaching, and 0 out of 2 correct, they were below. So they were scored within the same scoring rubric, just a little bit different. The conclusion of this research study was manipulatives do work in separating abstract ideas into more concrete concepts. What I mean by that is when I was scoring these daily exit tickets and weekly quizzes, I was noticing a trend of student scores. So it was based off of student percentages that scored in each of the categories. For daily exit tickets, there were 3 categories. For weekly quizzes, there were 5 categories. 4 categories. And I was seeing a trend going up. I was also seeing a transition from students scoring approach rate on into mastery, or students scoring at meeting on into mastery, or approaching into meeting, and so on and so forth. In the second bulleted point, I said hands-on learning through manipulative support cognitive processing when solving word problems. Students were able to use their what they were reading up here, so their reading comprehension to then be transferred onto paper. And while they're working, they're able to make those connections necessary to separate those abstract ideas because they are using those concrete objects to work through the word problems. So as I am watching these students throughout this 3-week time period, I'm watching them initially begin the word problem solving a lot quicker. And I don't mean that they're solving these word problems quicker. I don't mean that they are getting it done a lot quicker. What I mean by that is they are using that what they are reading, they're getting it up here and transferring that down on paper and working those math manipulatives at an initial starting point quicker. So prior to implementing these math manipulatives, I could see the struggle in students trying to find the way to start. where do I begin? With what equation? With what number on this word problem? Where do I start? And at this point, I'm watching students begin working quicker, that initial start. So that's what I mean by hands-on learning did support cognitive processing, because I believe when they are working those word problems with those math manipulatives and they are beginning a lot quicker, they're feeling more comfortable, they're feeling more confident, they're seeing it, they're feeling it, they're touching it, they're working with these math manipulatives, and they are able to process and comprehend what they are reading with a lot more ease. The third bulleted point says manipulatives require more time when implemented, but prove to be beneficial in student learning. And you'll see that in the next slide. Uh-oh. I think I skipped to from the conclusions, but we'll go on and read the results. So manipulatives were effective in supporting students in solving two-step word problems. Again, what I said in the conclusions, but let's move on down. So data revealed transitions from below expectations into approaching and meeting expectations. So that's what I was talking about earlier when I skipped on to conclusions by mistake, that you were seeing a trend from the graphs that I created from their data of students who are in that kind of bubble region of approaching and moving on into the meeting expectations. So they were making those necessary transitions in the right way. So the third bulleted point talks about bubble students. Bubble students are what my school called the students who are right there at approaching. Either they're at risk for falling below, or they are in a position where they could step up. So we call those students bubble students, and they were the students who were scoring in meeting / approaching expectations. And the transition was there for into mastery. So they were going from approaching into mastery. The fourth bulleted point states student percentages proved manipulatives to be beneficial in their learning. On the exit ticket for day one, 52% of students scored below. That's more than half of my students. More than half of my students scored below expectations on their exit ticket, meaning they got 0 out of 2-step word problems incorrect. But by day 12, only 13% of students scored below. 13% may seem like a high percentage, but with numbers of students, I had 23. That means only 3 students scored below expectations. So that's very insightful as to how well these math manipulatives are helping my students be academically successful. In the last bulleted point, I stated on week 1 of the weekly quiz, 39% of students scored below mastery. And by week 3, only 13% of students scored below. Again, that just claims that the math manipulatives that are being implemented are supporting students and growing into and transitioning from below approaching or meeting on into mastery. That's not saying all of my students met mastery by the end of this implementation process or by the end of this research study. However, what I saw to be the most important piece of data from this research study was that push of students who met below on into other regions, whether it be approaching, meeting, or mastery of expectations. I just wanted to see that they were growing and that the numbers from below were being transferred on into those higher categories. So that is my research study. I hope you enjoyed.